Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Explore Spiritism program on Kardec Radio. In this program, I share teachings, resources, and reflections to help you along your way as you explore Spiritism. In tonight's program, we're going to address the question of whether or not Spiritism is a religion, but not as my opinion or the opinions of other Spiritists like myself. Instead, I'm going to present to you a handful of quotations from Allan Kardec and their context, along with some supporting commentary to demonstrate Allan Kardec's position in answer to this question. In some ways, I think that this question still comes up often, and we find ourselves needing to address it because the word religion means different things to different people. For some, the word religion carries a negative connotation, maybe from past experience or even preconceived notions. They may associate it with an imposition of authority, being told what they have to believe, or encountering unwelcoming responses to their questions. Maybe just teachings that they find contrary to logic or some aspects of science or some other evidence. But among them, we find those that may say, I'm done with it, or the spiritual, not religious, the agnostic, even some with no spiritual beliefs per se, but deep moral convictions nonetheless. On the other hand, some people are open to, maybe even want to define religion more broadly. For example, as something that helps give them structure to their understanding of God, life, morality, etc. Some people maybe want to have something in their life that they call religion, as it's familiar to them, or even for the sake of being easier, right, to explain to others or to answer that question, so what is your religion? So look, I think this may always be an ongoing conversation whereby at the heart of it, we'd always need to first establish a starting point of how religion is going to be defined for the purpose of discussion and exchange and clarification at that time. As I've already stated, my objective tonight is going to be to present the position of Allan Kardec himself. And we're going to do this by relying on some texts from a handful of different resources, all from Kardec. So this will be 3 books: What is Spiritism? Spiritism in its simplest expression, and Posthumous Works, and 2 editions of the magazine Spiritist Review. The 2 editions that I'm going to bring tonight from the Spiritist Review and the book Posthumous Works are not yet available in English, so I've put together the translation of them to make them available to you through my presentation tonight. And I'm going to start with a quote from Kardec that is found in the preamble to the work, What is Spiritism?, where Kardec writes that Spiritism is simultaneously a science of observation and a philosophical doctrine. As a practical science, it consists in the relations that can be established with the spirits. As a philosophy, it entails all the moral consequences that result from such relations. So here we have in the book, What is Spiritism? Kardec is starting the book by defining Spiritism as a science and a philosophy. Now, you will hear, as you explore Spiritism, that Spiritism has 3 basic aspects: science, philosophy, and religion. And before anybody panics about where I'm going with that, meaning among Spiritists, I'm not actually going to discredit it, as you will see. In fact, I'm going to provide some explanations from Kardec in his own words. And based on what I will present, you will see that this statement about those 3 aspects is not wrong when presented as such. In other words, you'll see that Spiritism does have a religious aspect. In the words of Kardec, it involves the religious consequences of the Spiritist principles. When we say religious consequences, we refer specifically to principles involving concepts at the base of all so-called and practiced religions. What we should not do is say that Spiritism is, in other words, by definition and as a thing, a philosophy, science, and a religion. Okay? If it sounds confusing, don't worry, it'll become more clear as I go on. But before I do go on, let's add a little bit of details about that first quote that I presented. So, regarding science of observation, that Kardec says involves relations that can be established with the spirits. This involves all the forms by which the spirits manifest themselves among us in such a way that they or the things that they do can be perceived, even observed. So this has to do with all the spirit phenomena, the mediumship, the influence of spirits on one another, including ourselves. And I will also mention here that within the scientific aspect of Spiritism, we can also include knowledge of a scientific nature that we obtain through the exercise of that observational science. It's not within the scope of my discussion tonight to get into all that, but that knowledge would include the more technical details regarding our true spiritual nature, and that which an understanding of our spiritual nature brings to traditional fields of study like biology, physics, chemistry, psychology, sociology, and general fields of practice like healthcare, mental health, and more. Now, what about where Kardec referred to the philosophical doctrine, right? He said it's a philosophy entailing all the moral consequences that result from the relations with the spirits. I want to emphasize that wording that says that result from such relations. Because yes, Spiritism is a philosophy, but it's not purely philosophical. In other words, the Spiritist principles were arrived at not through mere philosophical thinking and exploration by Kardec, right? It's not a set of ideas, albeit super logical, that an individual came up with and disseminated. Instead, it is the body of teachings of the spirits themselves, and which we again obtained through those relations, meaning the ability to communicate with the spirits, the systematic approach that Kardec took to engaging in those communications, studying such communications, and codifying them into the Spiritist doctrine. Okay? Now, with all this great information that we obtained and that was so eloquently elaborated on by Kardec to help us understand it, we come to learn about our true spiritual nature, about the evolutionary aspect of that, which takes us through the process of reincarnation, and about the role that we play in what we and others experience from one incarnation to the next and in between. These are moral consequences because of their connection to our moral development as evolving spirits, and the moral dimensions of our actions, choices, and efforts as we evolve and in accordance with our use of our free will. I'm not going to get into further explanations behind that first quote, but if Allan Kardec, in a book entitled What is Spiritism, starts the book out by defining Spiritism as a science of observation and philosophical doctrine, then I thought it was important for people to understand, at least in the basic terms, what we're talking about when we present that citation. Now, I'm going to present one of those quotes that we'll see from Kardec, in which he actually does express the idea of Spiritism not being a religion. It's from that same book as the first quote, What is Spiritism? And in this book, Kardec writes out 3 different imagined dialogues. Imagined, but based on his experience. And he does that to help address many of the questions and concerns that came to him from those inquiring about Spiritism, or in some cases, questioning its validity or its relevancy. And these dialogues with 3 representational characters included one with a critic, one with a skeptic, and one with a priest. If you didn't catch it, I actually did a 3-part series on this book and those dialogues in this program on Kardec Radio. So I'll put the link to that in the comments to this video for those who are interested in going back and watching it. And I want to give you a little bit more background before I present the quote. So within the dialogue with a priest, we can find a piece where Kardec's addressing the priest's concerns about Spiritism's usefulness and doubt as to whether it presents anything new. And to the priest, Kardec first points out Spiritism's emphasis on the importance of charity as our means of salvation, and Spiritism's teachings about the influence that the world of spirits has on our corporeal world. And he goes on to point out, as we're going to read coming up here, that, you know what? And it's almost as if to say, come on, you know? But he says Spiritism actually supports the basic essence of what religion is supposed to offer. And so he writes, now let's take a look at Spiritism's moral influence. Let's say that it teaches absolutely nothing new in this respect. What is religion's greatest enemy? Materialism, because materialism believes in nothing. Well, Spiritism is the negation of materialism, which has no more reason to exist. It is no longer by means of reasoning or blind faith that materialists are told that everything does not come to an end with their bodies, but by means of the phenomena, which are shown to them and which allow them to touch them with their fingers and see them with their eyes. Isn't that by itself lending a small service to humankind, to religion? This is not the end of the quote, but I want to pause here to highlight the significance of what Kardec is saying about this blow to materialism. Remember earlier when we established that Spiritism was not purely philosophical and that its teachings were evidence-based? This right here is an example. You know, in the very beginning, spirits demonstrated their ability, even still through the table turning and rappings, to come through and communicate intelligently. And later, for example, spirits would communicate through mediums and provide information involving people, places, events, and other such details unknown to the medium. Sometimes unknown to anyone present at the moment, but subsequently confirmed. And here Kardec mentions, in terms of physical manifestations, there were times when spirits materialized to the degree that they could actually be seen by those who were not mediums or even touched. By the way, though they're generally not commonly found among spiritists and spiritist groups nowadays, there are people in modern days doing this kind of experiments, having this kind of experiences. And I just throw that in there because sometimes people think it is only, generally speaking, in terms of the phenomena, a thing of the past, even for the spiritual realm when it comes to interacting with our world and making itself known, its existence. But the main point is the significance of all this evidence, especially in light of all the information eventually acquired. And anyway, Allan Kardec goes on to say, but that isn't all. Add the certainty of the future, the living scenario of those who've gone before us, showing the need for good and the inevitable consequences of evil. That is why, without being a religion per se, it essentially takes religious ideas and develops them in people who have none and strengthens them in those who are uncertain. Religion, therefore, finds a support in it, meaning Spiritism, not for those persons with narrow minds who see religion entirely in the doctrine of eternal fire and in form more than essence, but for those who see it according to the grandeur and majesty of God. So that was the first of the quotes I'm sharing, in which Kardec expresses the inaccuracy of including being a religion itself within the definition of what Spiritism is. Next, I'll show you another quote with the same subset of words but within a different context, and it actually provides some explanation. Let me point out that this quote actually comes from Kardec's book, Spiritism in its Simplest Expression, which Kardec published as a way to offer the bottom line essentials, if you will, of what Spiritism is all about, the summarized takeaway. So if it made it into this book, you know Kardec felt it important to put out there in a resource of this kind. And here Kardec stated, since Spiritism is independent of any ritualistic form, prescribing none, and since it is not concerned with any dogmas in particular, it is not a religion per se, for it has neither priests, temples, nor churches. To whomever might ask if it is acceptable to follow this or that practice, it responds, if you believe your conscience is leading you to do so, then do it. God always takes one's intent into account. In other words, Spiritism does not impose itself on anyone. Again, Kardec says Spiritism is not a religion per se, but he gives some explanation of that in that it's none of the above, right? No rituals, no dogmas, no priests, no temples, no churches. And then indirectly, he emphasizes the importance of whatever you believe, whatever you follow or practice, aligning with your conscience. And he says, whatever that is, go do it, go follow it. Spiritism is not here to impose itself. This freedom of conscience and the liberty to think, question, reason, and choose for oneself was something that Kardec emphatically stressed. If you read through several of his works, you will find it expressed in many contexts. So those who have felt constrained by existing organized religions, those who see religion and run the other way, often find Spiritism to be a breath of fresh air in both welcoming and encouraging the exercise of reflection and reasoning, as well as in offering explanations that they find to be logical and morally sound. Now, because it is another reference for Kardec's exclusion of religion from the definition of what Spiritism is, I'm going to add another text that is also one of them, in which he touches on this freedom of conscience. I need to explain for those who may be unfamiliar with this source that it comes from a text written by Kardec but not published by Kardec himself. The book Posthumous Works, as I mentioned, not yet in English, is compiled of doctrinal material left behind by Kardec in his office upon his death, physically speaking, of course. And in light of its value, it was assembled and published as a singular work. And the quote that I want to share is this. He writes, Spiritism is a philosophical doctrine of religious consequences, like any spiritualist philosophy, by which it touches on the fundamental basis of all religions, God, the soul, and the future life. However, it is not a constituted religion, since it has no worship, rite, or temples, and among its followers none took nor received the title of priest or high priest. These qualifications are a pure invention of criticism. So that's similar to what we saw before. And then he goes on. One is Spiritist by the simple fact of agreeing with the principles of the Spiritist doctrine and conducting oneself in accordance with the same. And then he basically says that we all have the right to do just that, just like anyone else has the right to choose their path. Now, here comes the part on the freedom of thought. Spiritism proclaims freedom of conscience to be a natural right. It claims it for its supporters just as it does for everyone else. It respects all sincere convictions and demands reciprocity. Freedom of conscience gives rise to the right of free examination in matters of faith. Spiritism fights against the principles of blind faith, seeing it as an imposition on man to relinquish his own judgment, and considers all imposed faith to be without roots, hence inscribing among its maxims, unshakable faith is only that which can face reason in all human epochs. Then, consistent with its principles, Spiritism is not imposed on anyone. It desires to be accepted freely and by way of conviction. It exposes its doctrine and receives those who come to it voluntarily. It does not seek to distract anyone from his or her religious convictions. It does not address itself to those who have faith and for whom this faith is sufficient, but to those who, not satisfied with what they have been given, seek something better. In other words, something that resonates better with their own reason and conscience. In the next quote I want to share, we get Kardec's confirmation about Spiritism and religion, but from a different angle. It was taken in an excerpt from an article in Kardec's magazine, The Spiritist Review, specifically the July 1864 edition. As some of you may know, in Kardec's time, Spiritism suffered a great deal of active opposition, even attack from the Catholic Church. So the context of this quote that I'm going to bring next is one in which Kardec is commenting on this strong opposition, which he points out is evidence of how seriously the clergy was taking it in terms of a perceived threat. Abolishing or even endangering the church was never something Kardec was even remotely interested in. His only objective was to share the knowledge of and about the spirits and the spirit world. For example, in this text, prior to the quote that I will share, Kardec was stating that the clergy's persecution of the Spiritist doctrine certainly did not stop its march. And he wrote, attacking Spiritism with the dogmas of the church forced Spiritism to address the degree of value in the objections, and for this very reason, to enter a field which it had no intention of embarking in. And then, as you'll see, he basically is saying, if I were to paraphrase, hey clergy, we've never called Spiritism a religion. Show me where we're acting as a religion. Who's given Spiritism this title is only you. But in Kardec's own words, though, he writes, the mission of Spiritism is to combat disbelief through evidence of the facts, to bring back to God those to whom God was unknown, to demonstrate the future to those who believed in nothing. And let me pause here to clarify that this God unknown refers to God the way Spiritists understand God, meaning something, the supreme intelligence and first cause of all things, not someone. A creator of everything in existence, including the natural laws that govern spirit and matter, and that do not ever condemn humankind under any circumstance to eternal damnation. Natural laws that through reincarnation and spiritual support always offer a road to redemption and the destiny of true happiness and spiritual plenitude. And a God that does not require human intervention or representation. So you'll not find in Spiritist centers practices such as christenings, baptisms, or weddings, and the like. Anyway, Kardec continues. So why does the church today cast more anathema on those to whom Spiritism brings faith than those who believe in nothing. Repelling those who believe in God and in the soul through the teachings of Spiritism is to compel them to seek refuge outside the church. Who first proclaimed that Spiritism was a new religion with worship and its priests, if not the clergy? Where has anyone seen thus far any kind of worship or priests in Spiritism? If someday Spiritism were to become a religion, it would be the clergy itself that would have provoked it. I have one more source that I want to bring you tonight with key statements from Kardec. It comes from the December 1868 edition of the Spiritist Review magazine, and something struck me curious in the title, which reads, Annual Session for the Commemoration of the Dead, Spiritist Society of Paris, 1st of November, 1868, opening speech by Allan Kardec, Is Spiritism a Religion? It was not the Is Spiritism a Religion part, but the fact that Spiritists would hold a session in commemoration of the Day of the Dead, which I didn't even know was commemorated in France. This day of remembering and honoring the dead is part of a cultural tradition, though, in many countries around the world. Those of you who perhaps saw the 2017 Pixar movie Coco got one example in the way that this day is commemorated in Mexico. But it is commemorated differently in different places around the world, ranging from solemn and or religious to festive. But it's not a Spiritist creation. After reading Kardec's explanation behind this Spiritist session, in participation of the overall collective tribute, I understood the reasons and changed my thoughts to, of course, why not? Let me explain with two details about this speech by Kardec. First, the transcript of the speech is quite long, so I'm not going to share it all, but actually a significant portion of his speech, as advised within a footnote in the 1868 edition, was taken from a previous publication of the Spiritist Review, one of 1864, which was 40 years prior, where it was stated to be a piece seen as important to include given its correlation to the main idea that Kardec wanted to deliver then, meaning in 1868. The 1864 article and speech was simply entitled Communion of Thoughts. Prior to the start of that transcript, in that prior edition, the introduction to that article read, on November 2nd, 1864, the Spiritist Society of Paris met for the first time with the objective of offering a pious remembrance of its colleagues and Spiritist brothers and sisters who had passed on. On that occasion, Mr. Allan Kardec spoke about the principle of communion of thoughts, as seen in the following speech. The second thing I wanted to point out is that even in the 1868 article and speech, Kardec's answer to the question of whether Spiritism is a religion is almost delivered as a point of conclusion. In other words, the support behind the explanation he gave regarding the way he answered the question in this instance was this lengthy discussion on the concept of the communion of thought, so significant to him that he included within it his original speech from 1864 and then further elaborated on it before giving or arriving at his answer to this question. So let's now get into it. After affectionately addressing those present, Kardec began his speech as follows. We have gathered on this day made sacred by the commemoration of the dead to give those of our brothers and sisters who have left the earth a special testimony of sympathy, to continue the relationships of affection and brotherhood that existed between them and us while they were alive, and to call upon them the bounties of the Almighty. But why meet? Couldn't we each do individually that which we propose to do together? What use could there be in meeting this way and this specific day? Jesus indicates that significance to us by the words, "For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them." And that's a quote from the Gospel of Matthew. But as Spiritism helps us to understand Jesus's words, Kardec goes on to say, I'm going to show you. This usefulness is in the results produced by the communion of thoughts, which is established between people united for the same purpose. Meaning the usefulness of them gathering together on that day was related to the whole force behind the communion of thoughts. He says, but do we understand the full significance of this terminology, communion of thoughts? Certainly until this day, few people had a complete idea of it. Spiritism, which explains so many things to us by the laws it reveals, meaning those laws of nature, comes again to explain the cause, the effects, and the power of this condition of the spirit. Communion of thought means common thought, unity of intention, will, desire, and aspiration. No one can fail to recognize that thought is a force. But is it a purely moral and abstract force? No, otherwise we would not be able to explain certain effects of thought, and even less of the communion of thought. To understand it, it is necessary to know the properties and the action of the elements which constitute our spiritual essence. And it is Spiritism which teaches us about that. The details of what Spiritism teaches on thought are not within the scope tonight, but it relates to the dynamics and the mechanics behind this force of thought. With thought as an attribute of the spiritual being, this is part of that knowledge of the scientific nature that I mentioned earlier. And if you'd like to know more about it, I suggest you watch the video of my episode 3 of this Explore Spiritism program on Kardec Radio. And again, I will put the link in the comments to this episode. Next, from a couple of non-adjacent snippets within the text following that introduction and mention of Spiritist knowledge, Kardec says, an assembly is a focus point where diverse thoughts radiate, and later, if the collective thought is harmonious, the resulting impression is a pleasant one. If it is instead discordant, the impression is painful. And again, we understand that more when we get into the technical details that we find in Spiritism. But Kardec then goes on to argue, all religious meetings, regardless of the particular religion, are founded on the communion of thought, whereby they can and should exercise their strength, because the goal should be the freeing of thought from the ties of matter. But he says, unfortunately, the majority stray from that principle to the point that religion becomes a question of form. And to summarize a great deal of text that follows thereafter, Kardec makes such points as these, that once religion becomes a matter of form, people, in doing their duty, so to speak, in fulfillment of that form, then judge themselves to be done with God and men once they, on their own, can practice that by themselves. Though he says certainly this was not the intention behind Jesus's words. He says that on top of that, people will also walk away, perhaps not from their faith, but from their organized religion, shocked and dismayed by the abuses and deviations among those particular religious leaders that lie and act selfishly or pridefully, albeit pronouncing themselves to be united in Jesus' name. That the consequential religious isolation, though, just like social isolation, is not good. When most individuals are not so strong in their faith and charitable nature that they don't need some kind of common focal point to inspire, renew, and motivate them, and are not so well enlightened as to not need any kind of education, or we could say at minimum reminder, that touches on their future spiritual interests. Kardec also discusses the idea of progress and the need for religions themselves to progress. In other words, to recognize that what may have served well in one period relative to the degree of civilization at that time can become insufficient later at a more advanced stage, and then the need to readjust to the current level of progress. So, eventually, he reiterates and explains, we have said that the real purpose of religious assemblies must be the communion of thoughts. This is because, in fact, the word religion means link. A religion, in its broad and true sense, is a link that binds men in a community of feelings, principles, and beliefs. Consequently, this name was given to these same principles codified and formulated in dogmas or articles of faith. Soon after, and here's where we get into the heart of tonight's topic, Kardec states, the link established by a religion, whatever its objective may be, is essentially a moral one that connects hearts, identifies thoughts and aspirations, and that is not simply the result of material commitments that one breaks at will or the fulfillment of formulas which speak to the eyes more than to the mind. The effect of this moral bond is to establish among those it unites a consequence of the community of perspectives and sentiments, feelings, fraternity and solidarity, tolerance, and mutual benevolence. If this is the case, people will then ask, is Spiritism a religion? Look, gentlemen, without a doubt, yes. In the philosophical sense, Spiritism is a religion, and we pride ourselves on that because it is the doctrine that provides a foundation for the bonds of fraternity and communion of thoughts, not by a simple convention, but on that which is most solid, the very laws of nature. Why then have we declared that Spiritism is not a religion? For the very reason that there is only one word to express two different ideas, and the general opinion is that the word religion is inseparable from that of worship, that it awakens exclusively an idea of form, which Spiritism does not have. If Spiritism were called a religion, the public would only see a new edition, a variant, if you will, with absolute principles and matters of faith, a priestly caste with its procession of hierarchies, ceremonies, and privileges. It wouldn't distinguish itself from ideas of mysticism and abuses against which the public opinion has escalated. Spiritism, having none of the characteristics of a religion in the usual meaning of the word, could not and should not be adorned with a title for which its value would be mistaken. This is why, and I put here in brackets myself, regarding Spiritism's philosophical sense, it is simply stated as a philosophical and moral doctrine. I'm going to end the discussion of this article here, but just to mention, Kardec did go on yet on that day to speak about charity, adding even more support to his argument. This guy was not playing around and clearly had a strong objective in delivering this speech on November 2nd of 1868. So when we put all of this together, we see that Kardec made his position very clear, that we should not say that Spiritism is a religion. I hope that this has cleared up some doubts for you and perhaps even provided some interesting material that you'd not been aware of before, had not had the chance to see the translation of or similar commentary on. And to close, let's just circle back to that first quote that I shared tonight, which is that Spiritism, according to Kardec, is simultaneously a science of observation and a philosophical doctrine. As a practical science, it consists in the relations that can be established with the spirits. And as a philosophy, it entails all the moral consequences that result from such relations. That's it for tonight, my friends. Thank you so much for joining. Any questions or comments? We'd love to hear from you either through Kardec Radio or Explore Spiritism. I wish you and your loved ones a great next couple of weeks, and I'll see you next time. Good night, and God bless.